The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.
The problem here with this bit of guidance is you're ostensibly saving a little bit of time up front by not documenting one or two or three sentences for a lot of pain down the line where someone may ask you, we're pulling a sample of cases for our audit. It includes these SARs. Tell us why you didn't actually end up filing the SAR. And you're going to be left shrugging your shoulders.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML compliance and financial crime to the real world. From pop culture to politics to trade, America remains the ultimate trendsetter, and that goes for regulation and law enforcement too. Which is why you should not be ignoring FinCEN's new guidance on SARs reporting, stripping back and relaxing some of the box-ticking exercises in favor of a risk-based approach. I'm your host, Robin Lycka, resident sanctions man at Strise, and in this episode we're asking, is the US giving up on SARs reporting? We'll be discussing what these changes mean in practice for compliance teams, how this fits into wider AML changes in the US, and will the rest of the world follow America's example? To dive into this topic, I'm joined from New York by Guy Huber, principal at FS Vector. Now, FS Vector is a strategic consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. Do you mind filling us in on the gist of what you do and what FS Vector does, Guy? Welcome to The Laundry as well.
Thank you for having me. My day-to-day job really focuses on helping fintechs and banks that are active in the fintech space navigate regulatory requirements, as well as build and launch new products. Outside of the advisory work, FS Vector has a Capitol Hill lobbying arm, and we also have a licensing practice that helps companies get money transmitter licenses, as well as state lending licenses and some other licenses. We really focus on the fintech space, have been around for the past 8 years, a little under 100 people, as you mentioned, headquartered in Washington, D.C., but we have a New York, a Chicago office as well, and then consultants that are scattered around the country. Very nice to be here.
So let's start by looking specifically at these SARs reporting and these new changes. We have a lot of different people, some new people coming into the podcast, different levels of experience. So maybe we can do just a little basic question first. Why do compliance professionals file SARs reports?
In the US, there's a federal regulation, the Bank Secrecy Act, that actually requires financial institutions, including banks, to file what is called a SAR. There's a few scenarios that are described in the regulation itself, but basically, if a bank or other covered financial institution knows or has a reason to suspect that there's some criminal activity that's occurring, or if money laundering is occurring, they need to report that to law enforcement and federal regulators. And the way that they do that is by completing one of these suspicious activity reports, what we call a SAR.
Can you give us the top line details of these new changes to SARs reporting put forward by FinCEN?
Certainly. There's 4 updates, if you will, that are included in this new SAR guidance from FinCEN. I think some of them are clarifications of prevailing requirements, and some of them are more material changes, and I'll just take them one by one. The first is what I would call a clarification. FinCEN is saying that a SAR is not required just in the event that you have transactions or a group of transactions that are close to the US currency transaction reporting threshold, which is $10,000. Instead, you have to have a transaction that's close to that threshold, as well as knowledge or suspicion that the transactions are actually intended to evade currency transaction reporting limits. That's commonly known as structuring. This isn't a new requirement. It's FinCEN looking to clarify something that was really already understood and out there in the space, but obviously there's been some reporting that they're receiving that needs to be corrected. The second is also a clarification, although in some ways you could even potentially frame it as a bit of a reversal. Um, This is an update from FinCEN saying that continuing activity reviews are not a strict requirement. A continuing activity review is a process that many banks, covered financial institutions follow to reassess essentially someone that has had a SAR filed on them after 90 days. And the idea is that the 90-day review is a way to update law enforcement if that suspicious activity has continued or is continuing. The third update relates to the one that I just covered. And what it's saying is if you choose to still do continuing activity reviews, and remember, FinCEN is now saying this is essentially optional, this third bit of guidance clarifies how the timeline for the filing works. And essentially, what it ends up saying is if you want to keep doing continuing activity reviews, you would file a new SAR 120 days after the original SAR filing date. This is a bit of a technical update, but some of the timelines and the triggering dates can get a little convoluted. So FinCEN's stepping out here to just put that to bed once and for all.
Does that mean that you have to wait 120 days until you file a second SAR report on continuing activity?
It doesn't mean you have to wait. The rule all along had provided some optionality to report prior to that 120-day deadline. But it's flexibility that's introduced in the rule to provide banks the option to follow this continuing activity review timeline should they choose. And in fact, the new guidance preserves some of that ambiguity. It's not saying you must do 90 days or you must do one of the other models. It's saying 90-day continuing activity review is an option that you have. And if you want to do that option, here's a little bit more detail about how you should do it in terms of the specific timing gates and thresholds. The last update is not a clarification and is a change. And what it's saying is you are no longer required to document the decision not to file a SAR. It doesn't say, again, you must not or you must do X. It's a little ambiguous, but it's creating a permissive space for banks to do away with some documentary housekeeping and record keeping should they so choose.
That last one seems to open up for maybe less of an audit trail on why decisions are made, but it might be my lack of understanding. Similarly, the 90-day cycle or continuing activity, that's something that I haven't heard about it in the local jurisdictions over here in Western Europe that I know about. But again, might be just my lack of detailed understanding on what actually goes on with SARS reports here as well.
No, I think you're actually spot on. Let's take the no SAR decisioning change first. In spirit, the idea that you don't have to put something in writing is helpful. It's going to be challenging for banks to do this effectively for a number of reasons. You mentioned audit trail. That's critical for regulatory compliance in the US still, and nothing about this guidance is changing that. You need to be able to show your regulatory examiners, your independent auditors, as well as for your own internal management QA and QC that a decision that you made 5 months ago, 5 days ago, 5 weeks ago, whatever time frame was sound. And a key part of that in today's practice, when it comes to SAR decisioning, case decisioning, alert decisioning, is a succinct summary statement from whoever was in charge of making that decision, what factors they relied on. If you do away with that statement, you are left with the full case file in whatever template you have, and a major risk that it's not always going to be self-evident what specific data points you looked at or what your rationale was to clear things. And I think the problem here with this bit of guidance is you're ostensibly saving a little bit of time up front by not documenting 1 or 2 or 3 sentences for a lot of pain down the line where someone may ask you, we're pulling a sample of cases for our 2025 audit. It includes these SARs. Tell us why you didn't actually end up filing the SAR. And you're going to be left shrugging your shoulders, spending not 5 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour or more retracing the steps to come up with the conclusion. I don't think this guidance is going to be something that institutions jump to implement for those reasons. What they may get from it is some incentive and comfort that they can pare back the level of detail and granularity that goes into the memos, but I don't think that they were very long to start with. So this one feels to me like a bit of a so what type of guidance.
And why are these happening now, these changes, and what do they hope is the effect of it?
Well, SAR reporting and SAR processes have been a pain point, if you will, for some time. They are highly manual, although emerging tech like agentic AI seems to be on the brink of changing that. But to date, they're highly manual. It requires a lot of analysis and documentation across a complex fact pattern, and that means that an individual SAR can take days, if not weeks, to move through the drafting, the review, and the finalization period. It's a lot of work. It's also a lot of work that banks and other financial institutions are doing without necessarily having a clear and consistent view on whether they're filing effective SARs or ineffective SARs. You submit a SAR to FinCEN, and not to be disparaging, it goes into a little bit of a black box. FinCEN gets millions of SARs. And there's not a great feedback loop from FinCEN and the regulatory authorities to banks that are submitting these SARs to help continuous improvement. So it can feel, to put yourself in the shoes of the banks and compliance professionals, a little, I wouldn't say futile, but frustrating to do this huge amount of work and not necessarily have a great way of keeping score as to how well we're doing.
Yeah, like when I meet banking professionals or compliance professionals at conference, etc., the thing that they always say is like the only feedback they get is when they have some kind of conviction which is open to the public through the news or through media. So that's their only feedback loop. And every now and then, occasionally, you get to speak with someone that works in the FIU or in the regulatory body, and you maybe get some feedback that yes, we really appreciate the detail you put into your reports, but that's it.
Yeah. I think SARs are really the main vehicle to share intelligence between the banks and the regulatory authorities. It's sort of the North Star in some ways of the entire compliance regime, and huge amounts of dollars and staff power are dedicated to processes that culminate in a SAR filing. And as we've now said, there's not a lot of comeback in terms of this is working well or this isn't working well, which means when you are thinking about how to optimize your program, improve things, which compliance professionals are doing around the clock, you're not guessing, you're making informed guesses, but you're not necessarily working against a script that is providing tangible feedback the way that you might like to. So I think the guidance is a shot over the bow to show good faith, I think, by regulators that they are aware of this problem, and they want to start chipping away at it. Packaged with the guidance have been remarks from Treasury leadership primarily that SAR inefficiencies, that's not the term they're using, that's my spin on it, is something that they're very focused on. They've heard the pushback from the industry, and they also know that they're getting a large volume of relatively lower value intel. And so they want to help the industry better prioritize, but they also want to make sure from a law enforcement regulatory perspective, they're getting higher quality SARs that lead to better outcomes. I think this is a first step. And I think we're probably going to see a little bit more both on SARs specifically, as well as SARs as part of the broader AML compliance environment coming from US regulators in the near term.
You kind of touched upon it in the previous comment as well, like the receival of these changes. Do you think the changes will be like a welcome relaxation of the rules? Will it be a couple of them are more like, so what, as you mentioned? But if you put your compliance professional hat on, what kind of risks do you see with removing these long-standing practices?
With the continuing activity review changes, I think there's actually two or three things that institutions will need to be careful with. So if I look at the guidance as a whole, it's really the car piece that I think has the most nuance and where I think banks are going to take a broader array of approaches and have to do the most critical thinking about what they're going to do. The first and perhaps obvious risk, and this is me putting my compliance professional shoes on, is you may start missing valuable, suspicious activity that you would have otherwise detected. So if you take this car guidance at face value and say the guidance says we don't have to do continuing activity reviews anymore, we can rely on risk-based processes, let's just swap one in for the other, you're placing some additional reliance presumably on your automated monitoring systems, which is feasible and reasonable, but you need to do the upfront work, testing, validation to make sure it can provide the right kind of coverage. And without that, I think that there is a risk of we would have been catching things with our 90-day reviews that are now slipping through the cracks. There's also going to be, from this car change, if you were to undertake it, some process, organizational staffing impacts, essentially the people working the alerts, and it still is a resource intensive set of activities, are going to be doing it differently. And at large organizations that have complex, varied products and customer profiles, getting all of your transaction monitoring staff on side with how the new process works is always harder than you think it will be. One thing that I've done a lot of in my consulting career is change management, whether it's in response to an MRA or an MRIA or a public enforcement action that often requires training on new processes, designing the new processes, doing the system implementation. And in my experience, they're typically understaffed, underfunded, and planned against a timeline that drastically underestimates the complexity of what's going to happen. In a nutshell, you're talking about moving from process A to process B, abstract, very straightforward. But there's a waterfall of implications that are difficult to anticipate on day one that you start to have to wrangle with on day 180. And that operational risk just means that you probably won't be doing your new process as well in the first 3 months, maybe even the first 6 months or longer as your old process. And that means bad alerts, bad decisions, bad outcomes, which overall increases your risk profile. Sticking with car, and I know we're on spending a little bit of time on the continuing activity review, but again, I think it's the one where it there's the most opportunity, but also risk here for the various institutions. I think there are some scenarios where moving off of a 90-day activity review framework to something that is purely risk-based or driven by alerts in your system is actually going to produce more work. You could hypothetically imagine a situation where you're no longer doing 90-day continuing activity reviews. You've filed a SAR on, let's just say, Guy Huber, and then 1 week later, he does new activity that warrants a SAR. A week after that, there's new activity that warrants a SAR, and so on and so forth. It's possible that you'll have individuals, bad actors that transact suspiciously in concentration in that 90-day period. And if you've done away with that 90-day continuing activity review process, all of a sudden you have to do all these filings as one-offs, triggering new continuing activity reviews, whereas before you had been able to handle all of that filing as part of one bulk process. How it all nets out is going to be institution specific. But I don't think it's necessarily a straightforward, we're going to save time by moving away from continuing activity reviews.
We're going to have to go to break. We'll be right back to talk about how these SAR changes fit into some of the wider AML decisions by the US and what this all means for the rest of us around the world. Don't go anywhere.
Ownership is important at Strise. Our UBO maps are a signature feature for a reason. That's why it's crucial that our users should be able to amend and edit the ownership structures of a company the minute they get the new information. Strise's latest feature, Edit Ownership, does just that. You can edit ownership information all in a centralized location. Quick and accurate data management is key to making sound business decisions, especially with no loss to your workflow. Goodbye, outdated ownership data. Hello, AML intelligence. Nice!
Welcome back to The Laundry. A reminder that all of our Laundry hosts are active on LinkedIn, including me, so drop me a message if you want to discuss anything about today's episode. We've talked about SARs. Let's now look at the wider picture of changes in approach from the US and when it comes to the AML and financial crime prevention. So there's one big story which caught our eye from the Wall Street Journal. The Trump administration is preparing a shakeup of AML rules. In a draft term sheet circulated to the nation's banking regulators, the Treasury Department has proposed taking more of a central role in the enforcement of anti-money laundering rules. And the proposal would give FinCEN the ability to veto a finding by another regulator that a bank has infringed on the Bank Secrecy Act. Is this a logical step or one that makes political overreach more likely?
Yeah, frankly, I have more questions than answers about this. It is, I think, very surprising. It does not strike me as a logical step at all. The main reason for that is there's potentially huge, massive scope that would be involved with having FinCEN, essentially have veto power over every enforcement action, public or more importantly, private. US financial institutions of a certain size often have ongoing MRAs, MRIAs. There's a huge volume of private enforcement. It's often on the back of long-term, in-depth examinations by on-site examiners who really know that institution pretty well. Um, and that's not FinCEN's job. FinCEN has a day job, which some might say they've fallen a little behind on in terms of promulgating new rules and new guidance. Adding this to their slate, especially in the broader context of what's happening in the US with big cuts to the federal workforce, seems frankly untenable and a bureaucratic layer that's difficult to envision being executed well. Now, with all that said, there haven't been a lot of details about how this would actually work, right? It's been thrown out there that they're talking about this. Certainly, there's been other rumblings about finding ways to concentrate certain of the executive powers in agencies and some of that consolidation. So it's not just FinCEN and Treasury that's being swept up in this. But it strikes me as very difficult to implement, probably more harmful than hurtful, but we need much more information on how it would work in practice. And frankly, I would be surprised to I probably shouldn't say I should be surprised about anything given how the past 13 months have been going, but I would be surprised to see new guidance, new rules that articulated that role for FinCEN in short order. I think we're likely to get rulemaking guidance on other topics and not necessarily this broad veto power for FinCEN, at least formally.
Well, maybe speaking about surprises, another part of the wider picture from last year when the Department of Justice halted the enforcement of the anti corruption laws that would bar Americans from bribing foreign government officials to win business. So, do you think these messages from the administration is that financial crime is not an issue, but more like an actual built in part of business?
I could understand how observers looking at specific actions as well as the totality of what's going on are under the impression that there's a fundamental shift that's happening in terms of how the US thinks about financial crime, and how it thinks about actions like corporate bribery and the relevance and the prioritization that we should give that. The lift has since been undone. There's been updated and published guidelines around FCPA that focus more on alignment to national priorities as well as reaching a certain materiality or severity test related to the purported bribery or corruption. But every day we open the news and we see new allegations of quid pro quo type activities, certainly with US business and members of the administration. So my sense is policing financial crimes is still a major priority for the US government, but it's more focused now on matters of quote unquote national security than it might have been previously. And national security for the Trump administration, and this all seems to change day in, day out, is increasingly focused on transnational criminal organizations, drug trafficking, and I wouldn't be surprised to see things like cybercrime get additional and renewed emphasis. And moving away, at least in terms of optics, from other types of criminal undertaking and predicate offenses for money laundering, which include things like corporate wrongdoing, corporate fraud, and the like. So, are we going a little soft on financial crime? Probably. But I don't think that the administration, the US government, is turning completely away from policing anti-money laundering, policing financial crime, and helping build and mature a framework. There's too many incentives and benefits that flow from it in terms of intelligence and being able to support those national security priorities. I think to see that kind of complete abandonment of what the country's built for the past 50 years or so.
No, obviously not. Maybe a softening, but at least there's a growing shift between the U.S. and perhaps its Western allies. In the EU, we're seeing a more centralized for the AMLA and the AI Act. In the US, it's kind of seemingly, at least for me as an observer from overseas, it seems like it's moving towards some deregulation, easing up on certain reporting requirements, such as these SARs and the cars. Do you think it makes things harder for businesses to operate globally when they have to comply with these different market standards?
Absolutely. Regulatory arbitrage, competing standards for large international businesses, and coming up with a reasonable standard, a global standard that strikes the right balance of meeting requirements in each country without creating too many country-specific appendices is a huge, huge pain and challenge point for large SIFIs and globally significant institutions. You have, I know we've been talking about transaction monitoring and SARs, that if you open up the typical Know Your Customer program, it runs close to 1,000 pages with all of the country specific addenda and country specific rules. And I agree. I think what people would like to see, not just compliance professionals, but the relationship managers who have to handhold their clients through onerous and awful KYC programs, is some greater standardization across this so that we're not dealing with US versus EU versus LATAM requirements all the time. And what I think you're also right in that the US obviously is in a deregulatory mindset, taking its foot off the gas in terms of promulgating rules, pausing rules, reversing rules. FinCEN and others had spent a lot of time preparing to launch new beneficial owner reporting requirements. There was a proposed rule to bring investment advisors within the scope of AML program requirements. Both of those have been suspended seemingly indefinitely. And those would have been positive developments in terms of helping bridge that consistency within the US, as well as critically with our partners across the Atlantic and beyond. And without that, it's creating a lot of cost and inefficiency for compliance professionals to sort of continuously reassess and rebuild a global framework that accounts for a growing divide between how major financial centers think that KYC and transaction monitoring and financial crimes should be handled. I think there's also an element of it that's involved with, well, now the US is a little bit higher risk, and we have to do some additional scrutiny and due diligence related to our activity and our customers that are located in the US. I think that's probably less of a concern than just the flat problem of we've got all of these competing regulatory standards and how do you make heads or tails of them. But I think that's also part of the calculus.
And once you start adding all of this up, do you think financial crime in America is harder to detect than before? I'll elaborate. I'm thinking like with the amount of regulatory requirements that are known to criminals and how quickly criminals move to pivot once the regulatory changes are there. Maybe the openness about all of the regulatory changes, do you think that that leads to criminals always being one step ahead of the game?
I think criminals are always one step ahead of the game. I think that will perennially be a problem. I think the innovation is always going to slightly favor the bad actors. Not all of the bad actors, but the ones that are sophisticated and creative, and have the resources and the connections are always going to be a few moves ahead of the compliance professionals, law enforcement, etc. The recent changes that we've seen in the US, including this loosening of the SAR guidance, I don't think are a massive step back in terms of our ability to detect financial crimes. It's a little loosening at the margins, but I think the expertise and critically the data and the systems are in place, and you're continuing to see, especially with agentic AI tech and what LLMs are able to do. I think the tech stacks, and improvements and investments that banks have made in their data architecture mean that we're still catching up to the criminals more than we are falling behind. Now, that's not to say that we wake up tomorrow and there are some wholesale changes to the US regulatory framework that couldn't change on a dime. And certainly there've been massive cuts to branches of the US government that help pull all of that intel and insight that's spread across the US financial institution into shared risk assessment reports, updated guidance. We talked about perhaps a bad job that FinCEN has done sharing tactical information on SAR effectiveness, but it also plays a key role in terms of pushing out to the industry views on what money laundering is happening out there. What are the major typologies? How do we see sophisticated money movement networks in the Middle East, in Russia, in Europe, in Latin America working? And so there are forms where that intel is pushed back out, and I think some of the cuts there are harmful and will have a bit of a setback in terms of the industry. So I think we're paused in terms of our ability to keep reasonably up with innovations on the bad actor side. But I don't think I think we're paused and not necessarily taking steps back quite yet.
There's a lot of talk about shared intelligence between banks and public-private sector partnerships, etc., in Norway. And I'm thinking if only there was a tech company with a graph model that would allow for shared risk assessment reports. That would be amazing. Just kidding. Shameless plug. Before we end this episode, Guy, we're going to dish out some quick fire questions for you. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Will the new SARs reporting changes help or hinder compliance professionals?
I think there's benefits down the line, but I think this is probably creating more headache than efficiency right now and in the near term.
Will it lead to more financial crime being caught?
Down the road, I'd say yes, but I'd qualify that slightly, perhaps a little cheekily, by saying
a hopeful yes.
Some. I don't think there's huge improvements and efficiencies that are coming on the back of just this guidance that we've seen published.
Will the banks and fintechs be happy with this new deregulation?
Yes, I think there's headache, but I think that there should be some room for optimism that this is part one of perhaps a 2 or 3 or even 5-part series of changes. And that as we see those other changes come down, how the changes to SARs should work out in terms of a broader compliance overhaul will become a little bit more clear. So I think there's reason to be optimistic that, acknowledging the criticisms that I've shared of the guidance, that there's still room for further improvement here.
And to quickly summarize, is the US giving up on SARs reporting?
Definitely not. No, I don't think so. I think national security, whichever party is in charge of the White House in the US, has always been important. There's a lot of different ways to frame national security, but SARs are really a key piece of sharing intelligence about huge amounts of money movement and bad actors in the US, and I don't see that going away anytime soon.
That brings this spin of The Laundry to an end. Guy, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn, and that's probably the best place.
Money makes the world go round.
Thank you all for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, check out the back catalog of more than 140 episodes and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. Please share the podcast on your social media channels, tell a colleague to subscribe, maybe give us a 5-star rating. It really helps people to find us. Got something you want to share with us? Comment on the Strise LinkedIn, my LinkedIn, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Robin, our producer was Matthew, and our editor was Dominic. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise. Visit strise.ai for more information and see you next time.
Money makes the world go round. It makes the world go round.
Bingo bango. Welcome back. 2026. Here we go.
Bippity boppity boop, motherfuckers.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.